Kim Tai-ho's boots crunched against the crimson dust as he walked deeper into New Sonora's forgotten territories. The twin suns blazed overhead, casting strange shadows across the barren landscape. His environmental scanner beeped steadily in his calloused hands, searching for the source of the irrigation failures that had been plaguing their colony for weeks. 3 months had passed since Hana's funeral. 3 months since the colony plague had taken his beloved wife, leaving him alone in their small prefab home on the edge of civilization. The other colonists meant well with their casseroles and sympathetic smiles, but Tai-ho couldn't bear their pitying glances. That's why he'd volunteered for this solo survey mission into the wasteland beyond their settlement's protective barriers. The scanner's beeping grew more urgent as he climbed a rocky ridge. Strange energy readings were coming from somewhere ahead. Unlike anything in the colonial database, New Sonora was supposed to be a dead world, suitable only for terraforming operations. Yet something was definitely alive out here. As he crested the hill, Tai-ho stopped dead in his tracks. A massive crystalline cactus towered before him, easily 30 feet tall and glowing with an inner light that shifted from deep purple to electric blue. These formations weren't supposed to exist anywhere near the human settlement. The colonial surveys had been clear about that. But it wasn't the impossible plant that made his heart race. It was the sound. A soft, melodic whimpering drifted on the desert wind. Musical notes that seemed to speak directly to his soul, conveying pain and terror without words. Tai-ho had heard similar sounds before, late at night when Hana would wake from nightmares about her childhood in the refugee camps. He approached cautiously, scanner forgotten in his trembling hands. The crystalline cactus pulsed brighter as he drew near, as if responding to his presence. And there, bound to the translucent spines with crude metal restraints, were 2 small figures, children, but not human children. Their skin was pale blue like morning sky, shifting to silver wherever the sunlight touched them. Delicate scales covered their arms and faces, catching the light like tiny mirrors. Their hair was white as starlight, flowing despite the still air. But it was their eyes that stopped Tai-ho's breath entirely. Large and luminous, colored like deep ocean water. Those eyes held an intelligence that seemed ancient despite their obvious youth. They looked at him with a mixture of hope and terror that pierced straight through his grief-hardened heart. The smaller child, barely knee-high to Tai-ho, made a soft trilling sound. Her companion, perhaps a year older, responded with harmonious tones that somehow conveyed urgency. They were trying to communicate, their voices creating melodies that made the crystalline cactus pulse brighter. Tai-ho noticed the burns on their wrists where the metal restraints had rubbed against their scaled skin. Dried tears marked their cheeks. Someone had left them here to die in the desert heat. His scanner clattered to the ground as he rushed forward. The memory of Hana's stories flooded back to him. Tales of corporate security forces rounding up, alien refugees, of families torn apart, and children abandoned in the wilderness. His wife had barely escaped such a fate herself as a child on Kepler Station. "Easy, little ones," he whispered, though he doubted they understood human speech. "I'm going to help you." The metal restraints were sophisticated, clearly military, grade. Whoever had chained these children here wanted to make sure they couldn't escape. Tai-ho pulled out his engineering tools, hands steady despite his racing heart. The locks were electronic, but his scanner could generate the right frequency to override them. As he worked, the children watched him with those impossibly deep eyes. The younger one reached out tentatively, her small, scaled hand brushing against his weathered fingers. Her touch was warm, almost electric, and for a moment Tai-ho felt something he hadn't experienced since Hana's death, a sense of purpose beyond his own grief. The first restraint clicked open. The older child flexed her freed arm, wincing as circulation returned. She spoke in those musical tones again, and somehow Tai-ho understood she was thanking him. "Who did this to you?" he muttered as he worked on the second lock. The restraints were designed for beings much larger than these children. Someone had modified them specifically for this purpose. The final restraint fell away, and both children collapsed into his arms. They were lighter than human children, their bones seemingly hollow like those of birds, but they clung to him with desperate strength, their musical voices rising in what could only be relief. Above them, the crystalline cactus pulsed one final time before its light began to fade, as if its purpose had been fulfilled. It was returning to dormancy. Tejo gathered the children close, his mind already racing with questions. Who were they? Where had they come from? And most importantly, who would chain children to die in the desert? One thing was certain: he couldn't leave them here. Whatever consequences awaited him back in the colony, these little ones needed protection. And perhaps, Tejo realized as their warm weight settled against his chest, he needed them just as much. The morning sun cast long shadows across Tejo's small kitchen as Sheriff Park Dongwu filled the doorway, his bulk blocking most of the light. His uniform was crisp despite the early hour, and his hand rested casually on his plasma pistol. Behind him, 2 colonial security drones hovered silently, their red scanning lights sweeping the room. "Kim Tai-ho," Park's voice carried the weight of official authority. "We need to talk." Tejo stepped protectively in front of the 2 small figures huddled near his wife's old herb garden by the window. In the 3 days since he'd brought them home, the children had begun to trust him. The smaller one, who he'd started calling Nari after the bright flowers Hana used to grow, would actually smile when he brought them food. Her older companion, Bomb, remained more cautious but had begun responding to simple gestures. "About what, Park?" Tejo kept his voice steady, though his heart hammered against his ribs. The sheriff's eyes narrowed as he spotted the children. "Those. The colonial database flagged unusual energy signatures from your property. Bioscanners confirmed the presence of 2 unregistered alien life forms." He pulled out a data tablet, its screen glowing with official Terra Dynamics insignia. "Genetic markers identify them as Kythara spawn. Colonial regulations are crystal clear about this, Kim. Unregistered aliens get shipped to the processing centers immediately." Behind Tejo, Nari made a soft, frightened trill. The sound was like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, but it carried unmistakable fear. Bomb responded with deeper, protective tones that seemed to wrap around her smaller companion, like a musical embrace. Their scaled skin had shifted to pale gray, a color Tejo had learned meant they were scared. "They're children, Park. Look at them." Tejo gestured to the twins, who were now clinging to each other. "They're barely knee-high. What possible threat could they pose?" Park's expression hardened. "Don't let their size fool you. Terra Dynamics has detailed files on Kythera capabilities. They're not just aliens, Kim. They're weapons. Their kind can manipulate biological systems, corrupt terraforming equipment, even influence human minds through those musical sounds they make." The security drones moved closer, their scanners focusing on the children. Nari whimpered and buried, her face against Bomb's shoulder. The older child's eyes blazed with defiance, but her small body trembled. "Weapons?" Tejo laughed bitterly. "These 2 can barely reach my kitchen counter. The only thing they've manipulated is my herb garden. And all they did was make it grow better than it has in months." "Exactly," Park slapped his data tablet. "Environmental manipulation, it's what they do. Terra Dynamics has reports from 7 different colonies about Kythera infiltration. They start small, make things grow, gain people's trust. Then they corrupt entire ecosystems, turn worlds against human habitation." Tejo thought about the past 3 days, how Nari's touch had made his dying tomato plants burst with new life, how Bomb's singing had somehow fixed the broken water purifier in his basement, how both children had spent hours in Hana's old garden, their musical conversations seeming to coax color back into plants that had been withering for months. "Maybe," Tejo said slowly, "they're not corrupting anything. Maybe they're healing it." Park's face flushed red. "Listen to yourself, Kim. They've already gotten to you, haven't they? That's what they do. They use their abilities to make humans sympathetic to their cause." He stepped forward, hand moving toward his weapon. "Terra Dynamics has standing orders about situations like this. Any human showing signs of Kythera influence is to be quarantined along with the aliens." The children sensed the growing tension. Their musical communication grew more urgent, and suddenly every plant in Tejo's kitchen began to glow with soft bioluminescence. The tomatoes on his windowsill pulsed with warm light, and the herb garden shimmered like it was made of living stars. "Incredible," one of the security drones announced in its mechanical voice. Bioharmonic resonance detected. Subjects are actively manipulating local plant life. Park drew his plasma pistol. That's enough evidence for me. Step away from the aliens, Kim. Terra Dynamics will want to study this phenomenon. Taeho's mind raced back to Hana's journals, hidden in their bedroom closet. Pages filled with her careful handwriting, documenting the horrors she'd witnessed in the corporate relocation camps on Kepler Station. Families torn apart, children experimented on. Entire species declared security risks to justify their exploitation. Study them? Taeho's voice grew cold. You mean experiment on them? Just like Terra Dynamics did to the Arcturian refugees 20 years ago, just like they did to my wife's people. Park's weapon wavered slightly. Hana never mentioned being a refugee, because she was smart enough to hide it, because she knew what happens to aliens who trust corporate promises of protection. Taeho spread his arms wide, shielding the children completely. These kids aren't weapons, Park, they're survivors. Someone chained them to die in the desert, and now you want to hand them over to the same people who probably ordered it done. The sheriff's expression grew uncertain. He'd known Hana Kim for years, had attended her funeral, had seen how her death had broken his friend. Kim, I have my orders. If I don't bring them in, Terra Dynamics will send military contractors. They won't be as gentle as I'm being. Behind Taeho, the children's singing grew stronger. The bioluminescence spread beyond the plants, touching the walls themselves. His modest kitchen began to pulse with living light, as if the very air was responding to their harmonies. Then you'll have to arrest me too, Taeho said quietly, because I'm not letting anyone take these children. Not after what I've seen. Not after what Hana wrote about corporate mercy. Park stared at his old friend, weapon still drawn but no longer pointing it forward. The security drones waited for orders, their scanners tracking the growing energy patterns around the house. Kim, Park said finally, his voice heavy with something that might have been regret. You're making a mistake that's going to get people hurt? Maybe, Taeho replied, his hand finding Nari's small warm fingers. But it's my mistake to make. 3 weeks had passed since Sheriff Park's tense visit, and New Sonora was witnessing something that defied every scientific principle. The colonists knew. What started in Taeho's modest backyard had spread like ripples across the settlement, transforming their struggling frontier world into something that belonged in paradise. The morning air hummed with an energy that made everyone's skin tingle. Where once only hardy desert weeds had managed to survive, now gardens exploded with colors that shouldn't exist on this barren planet. Tomatoes the size of melons hung heavy on vines that stretched toward the sky like green towers. Cornstalks grew so tall that children could walk beneath them as if through emerald tunnels. Dr. Lee Sunmi pressed her scanner against a massive pumpkin that had grown overnight in the colony's central garden. The readings made her shake her head in disbelief. The cellular regeneration rate is impossible, she muttered, adjusting her equipment for the third time. These plants are repairing genetic damage that should take decades to heal naturally. Taeho watched from his porch as Nari and Bomb played among the transformed landscape. The smaller child, Nari, would touch a wilted flower and giggle as it burst into brilliant bloom. Her musical laughter seemed to make the very air shimmer with golden light. Bomb, more serious but equally magical, would hum low melodies that made entire fruit trees bend their branches down to offer their bounty to passing children. It's not just the plants, called out farmer Yu Jin-ho as he approached with a bucket of the clearest water anyone had seen on New Sonora. My well's been running crystal pure for a week now. The same well that colonial engineers declared permanently poisoned by the mining operations. Dr. Lee knelt beside a tomato plant that towered over her head, its stem thick as a young tree trunk. Her scientific instruments beeped frantically as they detected energy patterns that didn't exist in any textbook. Taeho, this is beyond remarkable. Their bioharmonic resonance isn't just helping these plants grow. It's actually repairing cellular damage at the genetic level. The wonder in her voice carried across the settlement, drawing more colonists to witness the impossible gardens. Children who had never seen anything but processed rations were picking fresh berries the size of their fists. Elderly colonists wept as they tasted vegetables that reminded them of homeworlds they'd left decades ago. But it wasn't just the food that was changing. The air itself felt cleaner, easier to breathe. The constant dust storms that plagued New Sonora had calmed to gentle breezes. Even the twin suns seemed less harsh, their light filtering through an atmosphere that was somehow more alive than before. "Look, at this," Dr. Lee whispered. Her scanner focused on the soil around Bomb's feet. "The bacterial composition is completely different. Harmful microorganisms are dying off, while beneficial ones are multiplying at an incredible rate. They're terraforming this world without any technology at all." As if summoned by her words, Nari skipped over to where they stood. The child's skin had shifted to a warm golden hue that matched the morning sunlight, and her large eyes sparkled with innocent joy. She reached out to touch Dr. Lee's scanner, and the device began humming with harmonic tones that somehow made perfect sense. "She's trying to show us something," Tejo realized. Through weeks of living with the children, he'd begun to understand their musical language on an instinctive level. They're not changing the plants. They're helping them remember what they were supposed to be. Bomb approached more cautiously, her scaled features serious beyond her apparent years. She gestured toward the thriving gardens and began to sing in deep, resonant tones that made the ground beneath their feet pulse with gentle warmth. The melody spoke of worlds that had been green before corporate mining ships arrived, of ecosystems that had flourished for millennia before being stripped bare for profit. "My God," Dr. Lee breathed, understanding flooding her features. "They're not aliens at all, are they? They're natives. This was their world before we came." The revelation hung in the air like the children's musical voices, beautiful and terrible at the same time. New Sonora wasn't a dead world being terraformed for human habitation. It was a wounded world being slowly healed by its own children. That's when the sky began to darken with something that wasn't clouds. The rumble started as a distant thunder, growing louder until it shook windows and rattled teeth. Massive corporate shuttles descended through the atmosphere like metal storm clouds, their hulls bristling with weapons and scanning equipment. The Terra Dynamics logo gleamed on their sides, along with military escort fighters that screamed through the air in tight formations. The largest shuttle, easily the size of a city block, hovered directly over the settlement. Its shadow fell across the miraculous gardens like a promise of winter. Powerful speakers crackled to life, broadcasting a voice that carried the cold authority of corporate power. "Attention, New Sonora colonists. This is Director Choi Hyun-woo of Terra Dynamics, Bioweapons Division. We are here to secure dangerous alien assets that pose a threat to human colonial security. Evacuate the area immediately." Around the settlement, the transformed plants began to dim their bioluminescent glow, as if sensing the approaching danger. Nari pressed close to Tejo's side, her skin shifting to pale blue with fear. Bomb's eyes blazed with defiance, but her small hands trembled as she reached for her companion. More shuttles landed in the desert beyond the settlement, disgorging. Soldiers in full combat armor. Their weapons weren't designed for stunning or capturing. They were built for destroying whatever Terra Dynamics considered a threat to their operations. Dr. Lee's scanner was still humming with Nari's harmonic touch when she looked up at Tejo with eyes full of tears. "They're going to take them, aren't they? After everything we've seen, after all the healing they've brought to this world, the corporation is going to treat them like weapons." Tejo pulled both children close, feeling their warm, rapid heartbeats against his chest. Above them, the corporate fleet continued to arrive, blotting out the sun that had shone so gently on their miraculous gardens. The battle for New Sonora's Seoul was about to begin. Director Choi Hyun-woo stepped from his shuttle with the confidence of a man who had crushed 100 rebellions before breakfast. His expensive suit remained perfectly pressed despite the desert heat, and his augmented eyes glowed with pale blue light as they scanned the transformed settlement. Behind him, 24 corporate soldiers in black combat armor spread out in formation, their pulse rifles humming with deadly energy. The metal restraints in Choi's hands were works of art in their own terrible way. Crafted from quantum-locked titanium and embedded with neural suppressors, they were designed specifically for beings who could manipulate biological systems. The same restraints that had held Nari and Bomb to the crystalline cactus 3 weeks ago. "Mr. Kim Tae-ho," Choi's voice carried the smooth authority of corporate power. His smile was perfect, practiced, and completely without warmth. I must thank you for keeping our assets safe. These creatures have been linked to ecological terrorism across 7 different colonies. The damage they've caused runs into billions of credits. Taeho stood protectively in front of the children, his weathered hands steady despite the plasma rifles aimed at his chest. Around him, the miraculous gardens that Nari and Bomb had helped create swayed in the desert breeze, their bioluminescent flowers pulsing like gentle heartbeats. Assets? Taeho's voice carried 3 weeks of growing anger. They're children, not property. Choi's augmented eyes focused on the twins huddled behind Taeho. Nari's skin had shifted to deep purple with fear, while Bomb's scales flickered between silver and gold as she fought to remain brave. Children that can corrupt entire ecosystems with a song. Children that can turn productive mining worlds into useless gardens. Do you have any idea how much terraforming equipment they've destroyed with their abilities? The corporate soldiers advanced, their armor clanking against the cobblestones that had sprouted living moss overnight. Their commander, a cybernetically enhanced woman with half her face replaced by scanning equipment, raised her rifle toward the children. "Sir," she reported through her skull-mounted communicator, "bioscanners confirm massive environmental manipulation in progress. The entire settlement shows signs of unauthorized biological enhancement." That's when Dr. Lee Sunmi stepped forward, her scanner still humming with harmonic resonance from Nari's touch. The colony's head botanist had spent 3 weeks documenting impossible miracles, and her data files glowed on her tablet screen. "Director Choi," she called out, her voice carrying across the settlement square. "Before you make any decisions, you need to see what these children have actually done here." Choi's perfect smile never wavered. "Dr. Lee, I presume, Terra Dynamics has reviewed your preliminary reports. Environmental manipulation on this scale is precisely what makes these creatures so dangerous." "Dangerous?" Dr. Lee laughed, a sound that mixed wonder and disbelief. "Look around you. 3 weeks ago this settlement was dying. Our wells were poisoned, our crops were failing, and half our children were suffering from malnutrition. Now look!" She gestured toward the gardens that surrounded them like living jewels. Tomatoes the size of melons hung heavy on vines that reached toward the sky. Fruit trees that had never grown on New Sonora's barren soil now offered their bounty to anyone hungry enough to reach up and pick. The very air shimmered with health and vitality. "The soil composition has been completely restored," Dr. Lee continued, her scanner beeping with each miraculous reading. "Toxic compounds neutralized, beneficial bacteria flourishing, even the atmospheric oxygen levels have increased by 12%. These children aren't destroying ecosystems, they're healing them." Taeho felt the weight of Hana's journal in his jacket pocket. 3 weeks of sleepless nights had been spent reading his wife's careful documentation of corporate atrocities. Stories of worlds stripped bare, species declared extinct for profit, children experimented on in the name of scientific progress. "Doctor, Lee is right," Taeho announced, pulling out the worn journal. "But there's more you all need to know about what Terra Dynamics really does to worlds like ours." Choi's smile flickered for the first time. "Mr. Kim, I'd be very careful about making accusations you can't prove." "Prove?" Taeho opened the journal to pages filled with his wife's handwriting. "My wife documented everything she witnessed on Kepler Station. How Terra Dynamics declared the native Kithara population a biological hazard to justify relocating them to research facilities. How children were separated from their families for genetic study. How entire worlds were strip-mined after their native species were conveniently labeled as terrorists." The colonists who had gathered to watch the confrontation began murmuring among themselves. Many remembered Hana Kim, the quiet woman who had tended the settlement's failing medical garden with such gentle care. If she had documented corporate crimes, they trusted her word more than any executive's promises. "These children," Taeho continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "aren't aliens at all. They're the original inhabitants of New Sonora. We're the invaders here, and Terra Dynamics has been lying to us from the beginning." Farmer Yu Jin-ho stepped forward, his bucket of crystal-clear water gleaming in the sunlight. "My well's been running pure for weeks because of these kids. My crops are feeding families that were going hungry. If that's terrorism, then I'll take it over corporate mercy any day." More colonists began moving closer, forming a protective circle around Taeho and the children. Baker Kim So-young clutched a loaf of bread made from wheat that had grown 3 feet overnight. Mechanic Park Min-jun held tools that had mysteriously repaired themselves after Bomb's musical touch. Teacher Lim Yu-jin carried flowers that glowed with their own inner light, picked by children who were laughing for the first time in months. "If you want them," Yu Jin-ho called out, his voice carrying across the settlement, "you'll have to go through all of us." The crowd murmured agreement, a sound like distant thunder that made the corporate soldiers shift nervously. Their weapons were designed to intimidate isolated individuals, not entire communities united in purpose. For the first time since Hana's death, Tai-ho felt he wasn't standing alone. The grief that had isolated him for months began to crack like ice in spring sunlight. These people, his neighbors and friends, were willing to risk everything to protect 2 small children who had brought miracle and hope to their dying world. Behind him, Nari and Bomb began to sing. Their harmonious voices rose like wind through crystal caves, and every plant in the settlement responded with gentle bioluminescence. The very stones beneath their feet pulsed with life, and the air itself seemed to dance with golden light. Director Choi's perfect smile finally disappeared entirely as he realized that his carefully planned operation had just become infinitely more complicated. The corporate soldiers raised their pulse rifles in perfect formation, their targeting systems locking onto the 2 small figures behind Tai-ho. Director Choi's augmented eyes glowed brighter as he activated his combat enhancements, preparing for what should have been a simple extraction operation. "Final warning," Commander Park shouted through her helmet speakers. "Stand down, or we will use lethal force." That's when Nari and Bomb began to sing. Their voices rose together like nothing the colonists had ever heard before. Nari's high, crystal-clear notes intertwined with Bomb's deeper, resonant tones, creating harmonies that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and speak directly to the soul. The sound was like wind through ancient caves, like the music of distant stars, like the heartbeat of worlds that had known peace for millennia. The very ground beneath New Sonora began to tremble in response to their song. Deep underground, networks of crystalline formations that had slept for centuries suddenly pulsed to life. The massive cactus where Tai-ho had first found the children blazed with brilliant light, visible even from the settlement. Across the desert, similar formations awakened one by one, their bioluminescent glow creating a web of living energy that stretched to the horizon and beyond. "What's happening?" one of the corporate soldiers shouted, his rifle's targeting system flickering with error messages. The advanced weapon, worth more than most colonists saw in a lifetime, was simply shutting down. All around the settlement, Terra Dynamics equipment began failing in spectacular fashion. The massive command shuttle that had cast its shadow over the Miracle Gardens suddenly went dark, its engines cutting out completely. The craft hung in the air for one impossible moment before crashing into the desert with a thunderous impact that shook windows throughout the colony. Director Choi stared in horror as his personal communicator, his augmented vision systems, even his climate-controlled suit began malfunctioning one by one. "This is impossible," he gasped, his perfect corporate composure finally cracking. "Our technology is hardened against all known forms of electromagnetic interference." But the children's song wasn't electromagnetic. It was something far older and more fundamental than human science understood. The crystalline network that lay hidden beneath New Sonora's surface was responding to voices it recognized, awakening from a slumber that had lasted since the first mining ships arrived to strip the world bare. Commander Park's combat armor seized up completely, its servo motors grinding to a halt and leaving her immobilized like a statue. Around her, soldiers found their weapons transformed into dead weight, their targeting computers displaying only static, their communication systems broadcasting nothing but harmonic tones that seemed to laugh at their confusion. The corporate shuttles that had filled the sky like storm clouds were falling from the air one by one, their pilots struggling, with controls that no longer responded to human commands. Emergency landing protocols kicked in automatically, but even those systems were corrupted by the planet's awakening song. Yet while Terra Dynamics technology failed catastrophically, the colonists' equipment began working better than ever before. Farmer Yu Jin-ho's ancient irrigation pumps hummed with new efficiency, drawing crystal-pure water from depths they'd never reached before. Dr. Lee's scientific instruments sang with harmonic resonance, displaying readings that revealed secrets about New Sonora's true nature that had been hidden for decades. The baker's ovens burned with clean, even heat without any fuel source. The mechanics' tools repaired themselves and began fixing broken equipment with an intelligence all their own. Even the settlement's power grid, which had struggled to provide basic electricity, now thrummed with energy drawn directly from the planet's crystalline heart. "The planet chooses," Tejo said quietly, his voice somehow carrying clearly through the chaos. Nari and Bomb's small hands found his, their scales warm and pulsing with the same rhythm as the awakened formations around them. "It chooses those who nurture over those who take." Director Choi tried to activate his emergency beacon, but the device crumbled to dust in his hands. His expensive suit split at the seams as if rejecting his presence entirely. For the first time in his corporate career, he found himself completely powerless, watching his carefully planned operation collapse into ruins around him. The children's song reached a crescendo that made the air itself shimmer with golden light. Every plant in the settlement blazed with bioluminescence so bright it could be seen from orbit. The message was clear to anyone with eyes to see it. This world belonged to those who understood the value of growth over destruction, healing over exploitation. Within hours, emergency shuttles from neighboring colonies began arriving to help with the corporate evacuation. But instead of finding a settlement under siege, they discovered a community transformed. The pilots and rescue workers stared in amazement at gardens that seemed to belong in paradise, at children playing among fruit trees that shouldn't exist on a desert world, at technology that worked in harmony with nature rather than against it. Word spread through human space like wildfire. The story of New Sonora became legend, told and retold on 1,000 worlds where corporate terraforming had promised prosperity but delivered only dust and poison. Other colonies began seeking out Kithara refugees instead of turning them away, discovering that these gentle beings could heal wounded worlds with nothing more than song and patience. The corporate terraforming monopoly that had controlled human expansion for decades began crumbling as worlds learned they didn't need to destroy in order to thrive. Stock prices plummeted, while hope flourished on planets that had been written off as ecological disasters. Children who had never seen anything but processed food tasted fresh fruit for the first time. Families breathed clean air and drank pure water drawn from wells that had been poisoned for generations. Terra Dynamics tried to suppress the story, to claim it was all corporate propaganda from their competitors. But the evidence was impossible to ignore. Satellite images showed New Sonora transformed from barren wasteland to garden paradise. Trade ships carried samples of impossible fruits and vegetables that shouldn't exist. Most compelling of all, they carried the voices of colonists who had witnessed miracles with their own eyes. Director Choi and his soldiers were eventually evacuated by emergency rescue ships, their weapons and equipment left behind as useless scrap metal. The director spent his journey back to corporate headquarters, trying to explain to his superiors how an entire military operation had been defeated by 2 small children and a song. Meanwhile, in a small house surrounded by impossible gardens, a widowed engineer found that family wasn't always about blood. Sometimes it was about choosing to do what's right, when everyone else chooses what's easy. Sometimes it was about 2 scared children who needed protection, and a broken man who needed purpose. As the twin suns of New Sonora set behind crystalline formations that still pulsed with gentle light, Tai Ho sat on his porch with Nari and Bomb curled up beside him. Their musical conversations filled the evening air with melodies that made the flowers glow brighter and the fruit trees bend their branches in a gentle dance. The desert wind carried the scent of growing things, the sound of children's laughter, and the promise of tomorrow's harvest. In the distance, more Kithara families were arriving daily, guided by the crystalline network's song to a world that finally welcomed them home. New Sonora had become exactly what its name promised, a new sun rising in the darkness, proving that healing was always possible when people chose compassion over fear, growth over greed, and love over power. The end